Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Clary. It's so great to see you. I post bookish and writing content every Sunday and every other Thursday. And today I literally could not be more happy to say that I'm going to talk to you about Tracy Deon's debut fantasy novel, Legendborn. I have it here on my Kindle and you can see I've tried to do something similar with my face. This is going to be a completely spoiler-free book talk, so no worries if you haven't read it yet. I know that it came out really recently, so I didn't want to be in the position to spoil people or for people to feel like they had to come back to it later. I loved this book and I think that this book is going to be huge for fantasy writing in general, which is my favourite genre, so let's not hang around and let's get right into it. So I thought that I would start by talking about why I wanted to pick up this book to begin with. The sort of very first thing is that I follow Tracy Deon on Twitter. She's just a very cool person. I really like seeing her tweets, and what really caught my eye straight off the bat is that this is a book that really deals with grief a lot, which is both a subject that's really close to my heart and also a topic that I'm really picky about, whether or not I feel like books have done a great job. And then kind of the fourth reason was that I read that this book was kind of a King Arthur retelling, or was diving into the King Arthur myths. And look, I know that everyone says this, I know that it's possibly a little basic, but I adore the King Arthur myths. I love them, and so I always pick up Arthurian retellings. Again, I'm really picky about them. I feel like they're really hard to pull off. I can probably name on one hand the Arthurian retellings that I have thought absolutely nailed it, and particularly this year with a certain Netflix series that came out this summer. Although I did enjoy Daniel Sharman, I was definitely ready for hopefully a really great Arthurian retelling. My initial thoughts were that I was worried about the smishing together of the modern and the Arthurian, because sometimes that, those putting together of those two things, that juxtaposition is really great, and sometimes it's really shadow hunters, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we only need one. But luckily I could absolutely confirm straight off the bat that that's not an issue. I think the best thing to do is just to read you the blurb. Should be better than me trying to sum up the book, which is not a thing that I am good at. After her mother dies in an accident, 16-year-old Brie Matthews wants nothing to do with her family memories or childhood home. A residential program for bright high schoolers at UNC Chapel Hill seems like the perfect escape until Brie witnesses a magical attack her very first night on campus. A flying demon feeding on human energies. A secret society of so-called Legendborn students that hunt the creatures down. And a mysterious teenage mage who calls himself a Merlin and who attempts and fails to wipe Brie's memory of everything she saw. The mage's failure unlocks Brie's own unique magic and a buried memory with a hidden connection. The night her mother died, another Merlin was at the hospital. Now that Brie knows there's more to her mother's death than what's on the police report, she'll do whatever it takes to find out the truth, even if that means infiltrating the Legendborn as one of their initiates. She recruits Nick, a self-exiled Legendborn with his own grudge against the group, and their reluctant partnership pulls them deeper into the society's secrets, and closer to each other. But when the Legendborn reveal themselves as the descendants of King Arthur's knights and explain that a magical war is coming, Brie has to decide how far she'll go for the truth and whether she should use her magic to take the society down, or join the fight. Wow, right? Okay, so kind of my general feedback, my more general points, I loved this book. I really did. I loved Brie. I'm going to talk about her as a character on her own later, but I just wanted to start off by saying I loved Brie as a main character. And I loved the characters in general, it's a really great cast. It's quite a diverse cast, and it's also a more diverse cast in terms of sexualities, which was great. There's a lot of bi characters. There's what I thought was quite sensitive portrayal of an NB character, but I'm obviously not non-binary, so I'm not like the person who gets to make that call. The one thing I will say is that although there's a lot of really great characters, there are just a lot of characters. There's a lot of names flying at you, and it makes it quite difficult sometimes to know who is who and what's going on, but I wouldn't say that's like a huge problem, and honestly I'd say that might be less of a writing issue than like maybe they could have put like a who's who at the beginning of the book. I liked the style. I think Tracy Deonn writes really well. It did not read like a debut at all, I've got to say. You know, sometimes debuts, especially fantasy debuts, and I've got to say for me personally as well, especially YA fantasy debuts, they can just be a little stumbly sometimes, like a little shaky. I didn't feel like that at all. If you told me this was her second, third published novel, I'd have absolutely like believed you. The pacing, it was really well paced. It's very speedy. You get through a lot of material very quickly, and the book never drags. It keeps pulling you forward. There's not a ton of exposition, which is what I prefer. It's much more a book that kind of fills you in as you go on, and I thought that was accomplished really well. How do I say this in a non-spoilery way? My main criticism of the book would be more in the structure. There's two sort of plots that run parallel. There's kind of a main plot, which is Brie trying to find out what happened to her mother, and kind of a subplot, which is Brie infiltrating the Legendborn. And for me personally, because that main plot is so much more interesting and you just spend a lot more time with it, it makes the subplot feel a little rushed, and things to do with the subplot feel a little rushed, and they don't necessarily have the kind of like hit sometimes, or kind of emotional resonance sometimes as I think maybe they're meant to, but that could also just be me. And then I have kind of three big topics that I want to talk about. The first is grief. This book is by far one of the best representations of grief, especially in a fantasy novel that I have ever read. There was so much that resonated with me personally, particularly Brie's anger, her real anger about not only what happened to her mother but her own loss of her mother. It was something I felt really keenly, and also other people's reactions to Brie's anger and Brie's worry about other people's reactions to her anger. Those are huge parts of the grieving process, or at least that I have kind of experienced myself, and to just kind of see them so explicitly laid out, like Brie's real worry, the way she's always thinking about how other people are going to react to her feelings, was just really spot on. I thought that was great. And I loved how angry she was, and I loved that she got to be angry. I don't really know how to say this. The fantasy elements, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, they played a really great role in talking about Brie's grief, even when you didn't think we were talking about Brie's grief. They just made it really, there was a lot of symbolism in the book, and it was so well crafted so that everything was about Brie's grief. You didn't have to say it. I thought that was amazing. There's a lot of moments where Tracy Deonn relates Brie's personal grief to the wider grief of Black Americans, and that was really moving, and it was incredibly well done. I think the real power of Tracy Deonn's writing is that she never hammers anything home. She really lets you work things out for yourself and get to places by yourself. And then to move on to Brie herself, I thought she was such a great character. I think that she really kind of has already risen really quickly into kind of the list of kind of great fantasy characters to me. Kind of, I talked already about her angry. I talked a bit about her anger, and I did really love that. I think what's really compelling about Brie is that Tracy Deonn's given her this anger, and then also on the flip side, there's a real vulnerability to her. I felt protective of her actually as I was reading the book. She's got this really raw side. In a lot of ways, she really reminded me of like Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because she's got that toughness. She's super capable, she's super smart, but then also kind of the same as Buffy does. She has two things. She has her kind of more femme side, and she's not ashamed of that at all. She does sort of flirt with boys, and you know, she's a teenager, so she has her teenage feelings, but she's not like, she doesn't feel like she shouldn't be doing it. And you know, she is conscious of her own appearance, and she puts, you know, effort into her appearance. So she's got that, and she's also got, yeah, this vulnerable, tender side. She's just this really human character. I think that's the thing you keep coming back to with Brie, is that like all the best fantasy characters, even though she's in this kind of beyond human environment, what she wants most of all is to be human. And then the thing that I think is what is going to make Legendborn this huge book, and I think it's going to have a huge impact, kind of a huger even than I think we're going to realise at first, is that Legendborn is a fantastic fantasy book about fantasy books. And this is the bit where I'm really going to nerd out. It gets incredibly meta at times. Legendborn has this does this amazing thing where it feels like it's its own new fresh thing, but it's very self-aware that it's talking about Arthurian legends, and it uses, even though it reinvents the Arthurian legend, it uses the fact that that's such an old, like, inherent, and is at the heart of so much fantasy writing, to really talk about the genre. And so, for example, I had never thought before, and I'm ashamed to say how much I'd never thought before about how much I, as a white person, just kind of assumed a place in myth. There's a moment in the book where, how do I put this vaguely, Brie is looking at, she's being told about the generations and generations and generations of Legendborn, and she thinks to herself that she doesn't have that. She can only name like a couple of generations back in her family. She doesn't have this endless heritage. And because they're talking about the King Arthur's knights, it really made me think about how I have always just assumed, particularly because I'm British, like this place in the Arthurian myth, like obviously it couldn't be me because it's not real, but like that myth belongs to me. There's no, that's my heritage, and I have a heritage that I can really plainly point back to. And I'm really ashamed to say that I had never really thought about the fact that for so many people that isn't the case at all, and how it's the same with fantasy fiction. You know, I as a white writer, if I got published, would be able to put my book, you know, as the kind of newest point on a line of fantasy fiction that goes all the way back to Tolkien. But black writers, indigenous writers, Asian writers, NV writers, trans writers, you know, basically so many people can't say the same thing, and how absurdly privileged I am to even be able to say that at all. And I thought about how in fantasy fic, history itself plays such a big role. And you know, that's something that Legendborn plays with a lot. Legendborn kind of sometimes explicitly and then sometimes a little more subtly refers not just to the Arthurian legends but to big sci-fi and fantasy titles. Brie and her best friend Alice quote, for example, like Star Wars to each other a lot, which I feel like is Tracy Dion both saying I'm a part of this tradition too, and also saying look at the way these titles are something that are so familiar my characters can just kind of quote them at each other and immediately recognise them and those references, and then immediately think about how that's not the same for titles written by writers who aren't white or aren't cis. And then there are subtler references. I'm almost certain there was a C.S. Lewis reference at some point. And yeah, this kind of constant, Tracy Dion is constantly referring back to history, not just with Brie's kind of search for information about her mother and her family, and not just with the Arthurian stuff, but the history of fantasy, the history of kind of the genre. And that made me think about how history is such a big part of fantasy writing in general. Like most fantasy books will be dealing with like historic conflicts or with historic powers, and there tends to be, you know, inheritance is such a big part of fantasy, and there's often a sense that characters will inherit something. I mean, you know, if you think of Throne of Glass, or you think of the Aragon books, you think of Lord of the Rings, there's often this sense of kind of something waiting, just waiting for characters to kind of accept it or come into it or be ready for it. And Legendborn is different, not just because it's, you know, it's juxtaposing like really different concepts, so it's its own, like I said, really new thing, but also because Brie doesn't have that inheritance, because her inheritance has been taken away from her. Tracy Dion explores a lot what it is to be an individual, you know, whether it's Brie looking around kind of a room when she's with the Legendborn and realising that she's the only black person there, or if it's, you know, just her being away from her family. Fantasy doesn't actually deal with the concept of being alone. the hero's journey tends to be that the hero starts at the beginning and they're by themselves and they don't know anything, and then throughout the course of a book or books, the hero gains allies and they gain power. So they go from loneliness and isolation to company and camaraderie or whatever. Whereas in Legendborn, kind of Brie actually starts at the beginning. She's got her best friend, she's got acquaintances at school, and the further Brie goes, the more alone she is. She's walking into uncharted territory, just like this book is kind of walking into uncharted territory. Yeah, things got really meta, and I thought it was incredible. So my sort of final thoughts about Legendborn were, yeah, I thought it was a great book. I loved reading it. It did have that pacing issue, but the more I think about it, the more I think that kind of this is so very much the beginning of what's going to be a huge arc, and it's just the sheer amount Tracy Deonn had to get done and the sheer amount that she did get done. I think that you can understand why some of the plots weren't as kind of in-depth as others, and I'm sure kind of later books will remedy that. And yeah, I think ultimately I didn't mind. I would probably give it like a 4.5. I want to say fuck it and just give it 5 stars. Yeah, just give it 5 stars. I loved it. I really think you should read it. I think that you would love it. So that has been my video. Thank you so much for listening to all of my thoughts. If you enjoyed all of this, if you could give this video a like or hit subscribe or leave a comment, I would all be so appreciated. And you know, if you do end up picking up Legendborn, like please let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it. And yeah, just once again, thank you so much. Look after yourselves. I'll see you soon. Bye.